Some of my earliest memories from Laos are really fun memories. You know, building toys out of clay and dirt. One of my very favorite toys was a corn husk doll that had beautiful, beautiful silky hair. So I often tell my children about my very simple toys that were beautiful and very valuable, and just lots of happy, lots of free time. You know, moving around, playing with my cousins, roaming through the jungles of Laos, I guess, if you can call it the jungles. Although I call it the jungle, and my siblings say, I don't remember it being a jungle, but I guess if you remember climbing trees and you know, swimming in lakes and rivers. So yeah, really happy memories of living in Laos. So it was just my mom. So my dad had passed away when I was a baby. So it was just my mom. And I remember, actually I remember the day pretty vividly. I remember that I was homesick, and my older sister, who would have been at school, came home to stay with me because I was running a fever. And I remember that there was a chicken drumstick that was left for me because I had been sick, and a chicken was slaughtered. And so there was a drumstick that was on the shelf that was waiting for me when I got better. But I remember my mom coming home and with my two brothers and saying, and we've got to pack, we have to go because the communists are coming, and so it's not safe for us to stay here. Uncle and his family are already packed, and they've already started leaving towards the Mekong River. And so we immediately packed whatever amount of food, and I think there was some jerky that was still on the shelf that we threw in a carrier. And I remember that my sister, who was the oldest, well, not the oldest child, the oldest girl, had to carry the bulk of our food. My brothers maybe had to carry water. They had these great big bamboo water carriers, so each of them were given a water carrier. My mom packed as much as she could of some sentimental things that were important to her and her family. And, you know, I think I had something in my hand, maybe some clothing items. I'm not really sure. And I remember her saying, we've got to go. And it was very quick and very fast. And so we left, and I remember seeing this row of people just walking. And we just joined right in to the migration of people as they started heading towards the Mekong River in the direction of Thailand. Yeah, I remember it being several days. I believe it was altogether 3 days that it took from us to get from our village to the Mekong River. I remember having to spend a few nights in the jungle and being told to be really quiet because we didn't want to draw attention from the soldiers that were looking for us, and to stay close and to be careful about where we were stepping. And I remember this very clearly because my mom would whisper, if you step on something that looks like it's fresh leaves that's on something, it's most likely a landmine or an explosive, and you will die. And so be very careful and just follow where I'm stepping and step in my steps. So we had to be really cautious, not only where we were walking, but how quietly we were trudging along. And even babies who cried couldn't really cry. They had to also be really quiet. And there were situations that were very traumatic because babies naturally cry. So I remember, you know, it was very still, very quiet, and just being very confused about where we were going and why, because it wasn't fully explained, just that the communist soldiers were coming, and if we didn't go, we would be killed. So when we got to the Mekong River, I believe it was really early in the morning. It was still pitch black. And I remember the river being this huge, massive, black, bleak, dark thing. But I did remember that there were some I don't think they were soldiers. I think they were either scouts or mercenaries who had returned from the refugee camps to help escort us across the river. And I remember that we had to pay them in order to get on rafts, canoes, boats, whatever they had available. And I remember my mom dumping whatever silver bars and coins she had in order to buy us passage on this raft. And I remember being completely soaked and wet because the raft was just bamboos strung together. It wasn't anything that was sophisticated. And so the four of us, my mom and the five of us, excuse me, my mom and my four siblings, got on this raft with some stranger who had our bars, our silver bars, and we hoped was leading us across this massive darkness into Thailand. But I think there was comfort in that we weren't alone. There were a bunch of other families and villagers crossing at the same time. And while it felt like mass chaos initially, with people negotiating prices and getting on whatever rafts or canoes they could get on, eventually I just remember it being super calm and peaceful and just hanging on for dear life and hoping that the darkness would kind of go away and we would land on land. And eventually that did happen. So when we landed, after we crossed the Mekong and landed into Thailand, I don't have real clear memories of what that was like. I'm told that we had to go to a processing center, temporary housing camp, where we would then process the number of family members, where we were then given an area in a zone in the refugee camps where we could begin to build our own makeshift home. And so we eventually were given a plot of land in kind of a open space next to a pre-existing structure. And I remember that there was a great urgency for my mom to go with my brothers and some of the older cousins to go into the hillside to gather bamboo and wood and whatever else that they needed to gather so that they can quickly build shelter for us. And I remember the shelter being very crude, but it was a shelter that lasted and protected us for a year. I think it's just my childhood reflection and memory that holds pretty positive memories of the camps. I'm sure it wasn't so positive, but at the time I remember just having lots of kids to play with, and I remember that it was really, really dirty, which as a child we didn't mind. Playing in great giant pipes. I think they were sewage pipes, but again, we didn't care. And I remember exploring. There's certain restrictions and restricted areas that we couldn't go into, but there were certainly plenty of open spaces that we could play in. And I just remember going to this cement building that was the coolest part of the camp because it was so hot in the camp and humid, that going to this big cement building was so cool. And we would lay down on cement building to cool down and play hopscotch with my cousins and newfound friends, but just being really communal, that people would cook together and eat together and visit. And while it was chaotic and while it was dirty, the kids didn't really care a whole lot because we could all be together. So I just remember that, we got food rations every now and then. I remember my mom going to a facility to get, I think they were dumplings. I'm not quite sure, but I recalled something seafoody inside something that looked like maybe it was kind of a dumpling. I remember those were really special treats, and I don't think we got those often enough, but I remember that being really special. And I remember We had to go and get our ration for rice and things like that, and just being very conservative about how much rice we were making, and and just really working together with other families to share our resources. So when we got to the refugee camp in Thailand, my mother was very quick to contact her relatives that had already made it to America. They had left in the first wave in the mid to late 70s. So in fact, she had a sister who at the time lived in Stockton, and who was sponsored herself by the Church of Christ in Stockton. And so through several weeks and months of correspondence with my aunt, she was able to get a sponsorship from the church along with my aunt's family for us. And then she started the process of getting refugee status and being interviewed. And I remember a lot of frustration on my mom's behalf, because she had to be vetted so often in so many different times by different people, having been interviewed, by the same person and the same kinds of questions over and over again. So it did take about a year for us to finally finalize all of the paperwork that was needed for us to be sponsored and to get the flights ready and to finally come to America. So I remember that we hopped on a bus that was packed full of people. And I remember this because we were one of the lucky few that didn't have to stay in the camp much longer than a year. I understand that there are people who stayed there for several years who were unable to get sponsorships right away into the United States and or other countries. So I remember there being really tearful goodbyes from my cousins and my aunts and friends that we had. So we were packed into a bus and then driven, I'm assuming, to Bangkok, and then boarded a flight to, I'm imagining, I think it was the Philippines, briefly stay, and then on to San Francisco. And I remember the flight being extremely cool because obviously it was the first time we all had flown, but to be sitting in such luxury, right? These beautiful seats. And I just remember feeling so well embraced and cared for by the flight attendants. I remember having a soft felt blanket, and I never experienced that before. And that was really cool, and I think I might have taken with me. I don't know. But I remember that my brothers refused to sleep, even though it was a really, really long flight, because for the first time they got to have Coke or Pepsi, I can't remember. And that was the coolest thing for them. So they stayed up the whole time so they could have continuous soda on the flight from Thailand to America. What I remember is having to go to a processing center, and then we were put in I believe it was a hotel room or some kind of detention center that felt like a hotel room. It was a small room with 2 twin-size beds that all 4 of us shared. So my 2 brothers on one small bed, and my mom and my sister and I on the other small bed. So maybe it was more than a twin-size bed, but I remember them being really small. But I remember that, again, my brothers, I don't know what it is about boys and new adventures, right? Were so excited to have these mattress things that they spent most of their time jumping on these mattresses. But I also remembered having to use the restrooms for the very first time. And I recalled a story that a friend had told me before we left the camp. And what she said is, be very careful when you use these, they weren't called toilets, these potty things, right? Because in America, you could be sucked in through this bowl if you're not careful. So you need to be really careful about watching when you flush. And so I remember being very scared, and for a long time I stood doing my business, right? Which obviously over time realized it was completely safe. But these are stories that stayed in my memory bank. And another story that really scared me, certainly, when we landed in San Francisco was that in America there are these great big giants, and they look for little people to eat. And so I remember looking around when we landed to see where these great big giants were, because obviously I didn't want to be eaten. Again, quickly realizing that maybe these are just stories and myths that people tell each other, out of anxiety. But certainly these were the things that were in my consciousness as a child, arriving in a new world. Again, memories are really vague in terms of when we entered San Francisco and where we went from there. I remember that it was several days before we could be reunited with my aunt. I did remember that my aunt and my cousin drove out in a car to get us in from whatever the hotel or area that we were staying in. But it was just all really overwhelming and kind of difficult to take in, because I remember everything was moving just way too fast for us. And I can't even tell you where we were in San Francisco. I mean, I go back now and I think, well, I wonder if we were here. I wonder if we were there. But I can't remember where we were. My aunt and my cousin came to San Francisco and drove us to Stockton, where we stayed with her for about a month until we were able to secure an apartment. So we worked with, or my aunt worked with, the Church of Christ, and there was an organization, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of the organization, World Vision or World Relief, I can't recall, that worked with my mom to get us some funding, so we were able to get on welfare and get food stamp, and we were able to get enough deposit to get an apartment near where my aunt was living. And we got tons of clothing donations from the church because we didn't have any clothes. From Laos to the refugee camps, we didn't bring any clothes but what we had on our backs. My mom sewed us some things to wear on our trip from Thailand to the United States, but that was all we had until we got to San Francisco. We were given another set of clothing, but we really, aside from that, had nothing, and so we were given basic cooking ware and utensils, houseware items. I remember being super excited that we got a couch. And while it was in a new couch, it was a comfortable couch. And then just over the course of several months, different folks donated a dining table and chairs and mattresses. And so we were able to have a semi-furnished apartment with the help of the Church of Christ in Stockton, and certainly my aunt and her family. Yeah, so, I walked into the second grade class, and the kids were all seated on the floor. She might have been reading a story, something fun. And I remember them all just being really curious about who the new kid was in the class. And I think I was assigned to a buddy, a girl, gosh, I think by the name of, I think her name was Blythe, if I remember correctly, either Blythe or Carrie. I remember she was my buddy for the day, and I don't think I came with the lunch because she took me to the lunchroom with her. And I remember not being sure what to choose because there was this wide variety of food to choose from, and I had never seen anything like that. So I remember having my first sloppy Joe. That's what it is. And I'm just thinking it was this most amazing thing ever, which, I reflect back on that now and think, what was I thinking? That's the worst thing for you, right? But I ate a lot of sloppy Joes those last few weeks before school ended, because that was, delicious. But second grade was very, very short because, like I said, we started rather late in the year, but it was really fun. The kids were really nice. and really curious about, where it came from, and just really, but their curiosity was about, who I was, what I liked to do, just wanting to be friendly, right, and wanting to be inclusive. Yeah, it was just a really great introduction to the school. So where we lived, the apartment complex was all refugees. So it was all Hmong, Mien, Cambodians, a few Vietnamese families. So it was all very much kind of the refugee second camp, if you will, in Stockton. So everyone sort of knew each other. My aunt had her sons who all lived with their families in the apartment. My mom had some uncles and cousins that she reunited with. So we had extended family. So it was just a big community in this little apartment complex off of March Lane in Stockton. And it was fun. It was fun. The kids, would play Chinese jump ropes. I got to know my cousins and some of the girls in the neighborhood, and just it was fun. It was fun to play everyday Chinese jump ropes and to try to jump as high as we could. I think we spent a lot of time just roaming inside the complex because it was still a little scary to go outside. Although I remember that every Sunday, we would go to church because my aunt was going to church, to the Church of Christ. So every Sunday, members of the church would come by to pick us up, pick us up to go to Sunday school in the morning, and then we would have service in the later afternoon, and then they would have a potluck or a get-together at the church where some of us were able to, some of us, meaning refugees, were able to mingle with some of the Americans who were very curious and wanted to get to know us, and just were very, very friendly. But yes, Sunday school was really great. It was good fun because it also actually gave some of us kids an opportunity to learn English, and it was just a great time to really catch up, as my mom would put it. It's a time for you to catch up and really get your ABCs in line because school is coming around the corner again, and it's really important that that we do well and be prepared. So the church was really instrumental in giving us the kinds of additional tutoring and just very basic grounding in English before we had to go back to school, and we being the kids. But they were also really helpful, I recalled, in helping my mom enroll in some ESL classes, which she did, and actually started to learn how to sew, as a result of that. So I have very, very positive, fond memories of the summer times and the activities around the church. And then just during the week, being with family and being with other refugee families and recalling very similar stories. And I think that's how some of the elders were able to kind of get through that sense of displacement, because they could reminisce and have shared stories and experiences that helped them to form a community and a bond that I think was really crucial for them to get through those first early years. So I remember being really excited because I had the whole summer in Sunday school doing some ESL, having had some ESL lessons at church, and I had my ABCs memorized, which I was so proud of. because somebody had given me from church the one of those Richard Scarry books, right, that have the A through the Z, different pictographs that went with each of the letters. And so I remember all summer studying it, and I was so proud because I had it memorized, and I even had the sounds memorized. I didn't need to look at it. I was able to write all of the alphabets without having to look at it. So I was really, really gung-ho and excited. Started in third grade, had a teacher that was not a blonde. I had an Asian teacher. Actually, she was Filipina. Very, very sweet, Mrs. Castro. But I remember that part of my day, the first 3 months, I believe, was spent at another school. So we would arrive on the bus, check in with our teacher, then a group of us were rounded up and got on another bus and went to another site a few miles down the street. And what I now know is that we were all, that particular school wasn't prepared for a bunch of newcomers. And so there was a newcomer site at another school. So while we were there for half the day, half of our day was spent learning English as a second language at this newcomer center. And I just remember that the newcomer center teacher was so sweet because she would greet us at the bus stop. We would all get off the bus. Again, great long nails, these beautiful long nails, and that's how I remember Mrs. Puga would greet us. We would go learn English, have snacks or what have you. Then she would put us all on the bus. We'd come back in time for lunch, and then do it all over again. And I remember Mrs. Puga said, I don't know, a few months into it, she said, I don't know that you need to come back. I think you're ready to not get on the bus anymore. And so I didn't know what that meant. I thought, oh, okay, well, this has been fun to hang out with my friends and to get on the bus and leave. But she said, no, I think you should stay in Mrs. Castro's class. I think you're ready. And so I think what I now know is that, obviously we were always assessed, right? That I most likely was redesignated and I didn't need to go to the newcomer, which made me sad because I didn't get to be with my friends. But that's okay. So I spent the remainder of the year with Mrs. Castro, who was very, very sweet. And I remember at one point, I think it may have been like parent-teacher conference week or something. And I didn't know that I was supposed to have my mom go in. And Mrs. Castro said, is your mom going to come in? And I said, oh, I don't know. Was she supposed to come in? And Mrs. Castro very politely said, well, if she doesn't come in, I can go to her. Or if she can't come in, I'll go to her. So I told my mom this. And my mom said, well, why would she come to me? I can go to her. I didn't know I could go to her. So that was our first experience with the parent-teacher conference, was this sort of confusion about the fact that parents could go to school and talk to teachers, which was very, very good and productive. So that was third grade. Third grade kind of ended. Great year. Again, all the refugee kids, we kind of hung around each other, and then we had sort of this nice community that maybe was a little bit too exclusive, but it was a way to just kind of get through school together. And I remember the principal, Mr. Strong, I think was his name, was just one of the jolliest man. This older gentleman that always waited for us in the morning, greeted all of the buses, and then always waved at the kids as we left. And he just made the transition for, especially as newcomers, super seamless and very, very, very safe and very nurturing. Many members of the church really stepped up and mentored my mom. Actually, in fact, it was a really cool moment a few weeks ago when I ran into one of her, we called BFFs from when we first got there. There were these two lovely, lovely women that would come and take my mom to her ESL classes and her sewing classes, and taught her how to cook. Just, dietary, nutritional things that they thought was important for us to have at home. And so they spent a lot of time with her, just teaching basic conversational English to her. And they spent a lot of time in our apartment helping my mom. And as a result, we got to know their families and their extended circle very, very well. I remember there was a family, actually there was an elderly couple that was very open and very supportive, and they would often have families of refugees over to their house to celebrate somebody's birthday or to celebrate an event, Christmas or Thanksgiving or Easter. They would host these really great big parties. And I remember how exciting it was that at one of these parties, they threw a surprise party for me. And I got my first homemade doll, which was beautiful. And to this day, I can't remember where I put it. But they just were so welcoming and so embracing of our family and certainly our community. And then from our interactions with them, we met another couple that became sort of our family, very, very close family friends. They would invite us to lunch, after church service. They would have us over to their home. The husband was actually our Sunday school teacher. And he would bring his kids' toys and books and clothes to us. And over the course of many years, they just became sort of surrogate parents. Because I remember that when I was in 8th grade, my mom moved from this area that had what I would call the better schools into Section 8 housing. Actually, it was a South Stockton. It was a federal subsidized housing and a project, and I refused to go. And so this couple opened their home to me and said, well, if you want to continue going to finishing the middle school year, and if you decide that you want to stay and go to the high school, Lincoln High School, next year with all your friends, because I was very involved in the orchestra, and I had a really tight group of friends, and of course, being 13 and selfish and wanting to stay with your friends, I didn't want to leave, so I took them up on their offer, and I actually, in fact, lived with them for 2 years. So during the week, I would live with them, and then on the weekends, my mom would come and get me, and then she'd return me on Sunday. And so I did that for 2 years, and it was just a fantastic experience to live in a different environment, in a different setting. Well, actually, it was to be a single child because their kids had grown up and they had adult kids. And so it's just them, this elderly couple. Not so elderly, I shouldn't say that, because if they see this, they'll go, we weren't that old back then. But this very lovely couple, and, I was kind of their adopted daughter. So they'd come to every orchestra, performances and walk to the school because it was nearby their home. And come to parent events and evenings. Of course, my mom came as well, but they were always there, and it's, it was good. It was really good. And I'm still friends with them today. So, it's an interesting time because for whatever reason, being from Cambodia, resonated more with people than being from Laos or Thailand. And so often it wasn't so much that they asked where we were from, it was more about, so you're from Cambodia. It was a statement, a fact. And so I found myself actually doing a lot of correcting. Of course, when I said Laos, there was a blank look, right? Because in the 80s, it wasn't that well known. I mean, we were all kind of clumped together as refugees of the Vietnam War. So the Vietnamese and the Cambodians and all the new refugees were kind of clumped together. So yeah, just having to clarify for people, no, in fact, I'm not Cambodian. In fact, I came from Laos, via Thailand. But it was, it's just something that we did. It wasn't a source of frustration or annoyance. It was just kind of, well, we need to clarify where we're from. But there were times when kids were very rude and very not so understanding, and they would shout at some of us kids as we're going on the bus, or even for walking down the street, walking to the store and coming back. Hey, Cambodians, go back from where you come from. And there was a lot of confusion with that, because we would go, well, we're not Cambodians. Why would they tell us to go back to Cambodia? So there was a lot of that. But I think because we felt like, well, we're not Cambodians, it doesn't really impact us. Again, ignorance was bliss, right? But those were some interesting times, and just acclimating and acculturating and learning the language, I think, was more exciting for the kids. And so that sort of overrode all the other negative experiences that we had. And certainly there were plenty of, racist remarks and negative experiences from, kids and adults who just didn't know or understand or were interested in getting to know us. But we were so insulated in our own little apartment village complex. And when we were in classes, our teachers were so supportive. And certainly we had the church with church members that were open and embracing and supportive and just really welcoming, that all of those things really trumped the negative things that occurred. As a teenager, you're struggling with your own identity, right? Let alone two cultures, two languages, two sets of expectations. Of course, my mom, while she, having been a single parent and really values education and is very progressive, was very much of the mindset that we still needed to adhere to the gender roles of being a daughter in Hmong households. So Saturdays, my sister and I had to get the laundry done. We had to clean the house. We had to cook. Actually, cooking was every night for both of us, while my brothers did very little, if anything was expected of them. And so those were the expectations for us, while, having gone to school and being told, well, you can do anything you want to do. And, yes, you're just as equal to boys you're just as equal to boys, and you can do whatever it is that you want to do. So that there were two mixed messages, right? And I was so focused on learning English and so focused on assimilating that I resisted the Hmong cultural stereotypes and gender roles, which led to a lot of tension and friction with certainly my mom, because she was struggling with her own acculturation. So to have to battle, kids, well, specifically two girls who were saying, well, wait a minute, and starting to question why we have to do the laundry and the cleaning and the cooking when our brothers do very little. So there was a lot of tension in our household about gender roles and expectations. And so I think as a result of that, I held a deep sense of resentment towards, being Hmong. And having to adhere to very subservient, what I felt at the time, roles. And so I poured myself really into learning everything there was to know about not only the English language, but English mainstream culture, nuances, mannerisms, and the way they dressed, the way they talked, and really mimicking that. And so it was hard. It was hard for my mom to see that because we sort of started to pull away from what she had expected us, to be, even though, her message was do really well in becoming an American. So those were some challenging times. And I didn't speak a lot of Hmong because the other thing that shifted too is at some point we moved away from my aunt and the Hmong village, if you will, and went into a community that was more eclectic and mixed, so more Cambodians, Vietnamese, Laotians, and so we had to use English. Most of my friends were Cambodians and Vietnamese, and my mom was learning English, and so using English more, and in her workplace she was sewing and working and cleaning homes, and so using English more, and so English became in some ways, at least in our household, a more dominant language than Hmong. And what resulted from that is that I started to lose my Hmong as I became more competent and proficient in my English language, which to this day is a very sad point in my adult language interactions with the elderly Hmongs. Although I feel like I'm starting to get it back a little bit more because I'm more intentional about using it when I'm with my mom or with my elderly uncles or aunts. Luckily for me, my mom does not prescribe to that, even though, certainly she prescribes to very traditional role models. My mom prescribes to, while she prescribes to very traditional gender roles and expectations. Fortunately for myself and my sister, my mom was adamant that we not marry young, and adamant that at the very least we make it through college and have a career before we think about partnering up or getting married. So it was planted very early on in my consciousness that if we got married young and or got pregnant young, which, sometimes that happens, then the other takes place, that we would be disowned. And it was made very, very clear by my mother. And so that, I was very worried about because I didn't want to be disowned by my mother, even though I saw my friends and saw cousins and saw relatives that were getting married at the age of 13 and 14, and so very young. But for my mom, that was not going to happen. And so she made sure that education came first for us. So I remember that there was a brief mention of the Secret War in my U.S. history class in 11th grade. And I believe that it was mentioned because the teacher was very interested in knowing about the refugees that were going through the school system. I don't believe, however, that the Secret War was a focus and or that it was in any of the textbooks at the time. But I did remember the teacher mentioning something or alluding to something about the Secret War, but it was very quick. Not enough time was spent on it. Certainly conversations about the Vietnam War, but it was glossed over very quickly. And actually it wasn't until I was in college that I learned a little bit more about the Secret War. And then after I had gotten out of college and started to do some more research of my own, that then I learned about the secret war. So even though we lived it, and even though we understood the impact that our uncles and our brothers played in the secret war, that connection wasn't made real clear to the children that came over as a result of that involvement. From high school, I wanted to go into law. For whatever reason, my aspiration was that I was going to be this great entertainment lawyer. I don't know why entertainment lawyer was on my consciousness in high school. So I actually went to Pepperdine, private college, which was also a point of contention for my mother because girls don't go away to college in the Hmong community, because the sense is that as the Hmong girls go away, they don't come back into the community. And so there was a lot of resistance, but luckily for our good friends, the Merritts, who are our mentor from the church, they convinced my mom that in fact it's affiliated with the Church of Christ, and that I would be very safe, and it's a small campus, and there are some really great people down there. And they knew this because they go down for the annual lectureships. And so because she values their opinions and really leaned to them for guidance, I was allowed to go. So I was very fortunate, got some great scholarships, went to Pepperdine. I actually majored in psychology at Pepperdine. And ended up graduating with a psychology degree. But when I left Pepperdine, I quickly realized that psychology is a difficult major to find a job. And so I realized that there was more that I wanted to do before I went back to school, because I quickly realized I needed either a master's or a PhD to do anything of substance with my degree. And so I had an opportunity to go overseas to China to teach at a private school for a year or more if I wanted to. So teaching was not in my consciousness. I was going to be a psychotherapist. That was my goal after the entertainment lawyer did not pan out. And so I thought, well, here's my chance to go travel. Yeah, I'll teach, but really my goal was to go and see the world a little bit before I go back to school. So I got a chance to go to China, taught fourth grade, taught conversational English to a group of fourth graders, and completely fell in love with teaching, and quickly realized that I could do some really good stuff in the classroom, and that in fact maybe psychology or psychotherapy didn't hold the kind of appeal that I thought it originally did. And so I spent a year, taught English, then I came back, and again, serendipity, my brother was teaching in Sac City. And at the time, there was a teacher shortage, just as there is now. And they were issuing emergency credentials to get teachers in the classrooms as long as we enrolled in a teaching credentialing program. And so my brother said, hey, you're back, you need a job, do you want a job? Because they need a fourth grade teacher in my school. And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, teaching Chinese kids, I would imagine is very different from teaching kids here in America. And he said, no, it's not that much harder. It's, if you taught Chinese fourth graders or fourth graders anywhere, right? So I go into this fourth grade class in South Sacramento at Mark Hopkins Elementary School, and no, it was nothing like my Chinese class in China, where they're all uniformed and how they responded to me, and I had to use zero classroom management to get them on task. I spent most of my time at Mark Hopkins the first few months getting the class in line and really getting them getting routines built in. I mean, I didn't know anything, right? I was given these manuals and books and lessons and say, go. And so had very little guidance. Fortunately, got to meet a few good teacher friends who gave me some tips and pointers and some great strategies. So that was really helpful. And then I went back to my psychology training, right? Because I thought, well, gosh, I can apply some of what I've learned in group processing and in human behavior in this class. And so I started doing some circles with my students using a curriculum called Second Step. That was a violence prevention curriculum. And I did that every other day for a whole month until I got the kids in line. Then I was able to teach them. So that was trial by fire. It was very challenging. I had kids jumping on desks and sitting on desks, and it was very unnerving because I had these Chinese kids that didn't do that. So that was very challenging, but in the next few months, as I started to build a sense of community with my children, and saw the transforming and evolving classroom climate from one of chaos and craziness to one of structured and learning, I realized this is what I want to do. This is really exciting, and to see when kids really got something. But also to understand that we can build a community within the classroom environment was really, really powerful for me. And that was a huge shift in my career trajectory, because halfway through I wasn't sure. I was still going to go back into pursuing some kind of MSW or some kind of social work. And then I realized, no, I think education is it. This is really exciting, and actually was a lot of fun. So finished the year and enrolled in some classes, and I came back, invited to come back for a second year. So having had some of those routines and structures down the first year, the second year was much, much easier. And with having a new set of students, I felt like it was this clean slate. We could start building our community from day one. I used some of those same circle structures, and it was just a phenomenal year. And that's really where my interest in education and the value and importance of really building good relationships with kids really has become the forefront of my pedagogy, and in terms of really what I think is most valuable in any educational setting. We can teach content, we can teach kids how to do algebraic equations, how to read, how to cite evidence, but we have to show them how to build community, and we have to model those good, sound, social and emotional relationships, with our students and among our students. So that's been kind of my experience in the classroom, and really understanding the value of this work. And then from there, I realized that maybe some of my psychology work could also be blended with some of my teaching work. And so I went back and got my counseling credential because I thought it was a nice synthesis of now my new discovery and love of teaching and my where my heart has always been, which is human behavior and psychology and the way people related and interacted. And so I became a high school counselor, so left elementary and moved into the high school space, and did that work for a few years, and then had an opportunity to be a assistant principal at one of the largest comprehensive high schools in Sac City, which was very, very unnerving at the time because I had no plans to go into administration, absolutely zero ambition. I loved counseling, loved working with kids, loved working with families and teachers, and really just was intent on getting kids everything that they needed to be prepared for college. That was my sole purpose. So when I was asked to step into the role of vice principal, I was very hesitant, and in fact I turned down my principal twice before he, insisted that I really didn't have a choice. And if you know, our principal, Ted Appel, who led Burbank for 10 plus years, when he has his mind set on something, it's going to happen. And he just was insistent and persistent, and thank God for that, because it gave me a tremendous learning opportunity and growth in my career that enabled me to look at policies in education, on a microscopic level at Burbank, but having a better appreciation for how we can shape school climate and culture, and really work with teachers and students and families to create learning conditions that are inclusive and that are safe, that are respectful, and that are relational focused. So as an insider, as a refugee myself, and having been an educator for many years, and having firsthand knowledge of how the public education works, I feel like what other administrators and teachers in the classroom need to know in working with refugees, whether they're Hmong or not, is that we have to really build positive relationships with our students. We have to get to know their stories. We have to allow for their personal narratives to be told, and create a space for them to do that in a safe and welcoming way. Because I think one of the things that our refugee students want to have immediately is a sense of connection and a sense of safety and a sense of belonging. Everything else has been so chaotic and uncertain, right? That if they can have a place to go to, such as a school classroom or a school climate that is consistent, that is safe, that nurtures and supports and validates their experiences and their cultural background and respects the unique diversity of where they're coming from, I think that they will thrive and do so much better than if they were not supported in those ways. And I find that teachers who are nurturing, who validates their students' personal experiences, the kinds of diversity that they bring into the classroom, that really get to know their students really well, tend to have students who respond more positively to them and actually, in fact, accelerate their learning at a much faster pace than if they were not inclusive and not supportive and not caring and not having built those strong foundations. I think my biggest hurdle in the whole refugee journey and coming from Laos to Thailand to the United States was, I would like to say it's the language, but that's been actually the easiest to learn. I think trying to understand the culture and read the nuances of the culture and trying to fit in to that culture, while maintaining a sense of my own cultural identity. I think that constant back and forth struggle is probably the biggest challenge and continues to be a challenge, because there are certain expectations that my own community, have of me. And then there are expectations that I have of myself for both my community, my Hmong community, and my professional community, or, being an American. And certainly it's been interesting because I didn't marry Hmong. I don't know if you know that. So my husband is white. And so that was its own challenge in that now we have to sort of blend two culture in a very microcosmic family, unit. So teaching my children the the cultural traditions and nuances of being Hmong, and at the same time nurturing their independence and their success in this mainstream culture, and trying to keep that sense of balance, that dual identity, if you will, for them as well as myself, as well as my family, and certainly, within the scope of my community, has been a really interesting journey. It's neither bad nor good. It's a very complex journey, but it's a very exciting and positive. Yeah, it is good. It's a positive journey. One piece of advice that I would give educators is to be open to new experiences, to have an open heart, an open mind, an embracing of new students who walk into your classroom and or onto your school campus or into your school district, because they have tremendous stories to share and to teach you. And so if you are inclusive and embracing of those narratives that, again, either walk into your classroom or your school or your district, you will be much richer for having allowed those narratives to be a part of the larger, broader conversation. In fact, I've had cousins who have gone back several times and they all feel very safe. I think it's just maybe for me, having not gone and having not explored some of the childhood trauma of leaving Laos, I still have a lot of uncertainties about what that experience will be like. And then I'll share, actually, this is kind of an interesting story. So for a very long time, I had a great fear of water, like tremendous fear of water. And I could not figure out why I had this crazy fear of water, irrational fear of water. And actually my siblings didn't. I didn't know that my mom did also up until a few years ago. But at any rate, I survived high school swim unit because I had a life jacket. So I was allowed to wear a life jacket when I was swimming. So that's how I survived the week-long unit. When I went to college, I had to take a swim class as part of my GE requirements. And I had to be on the back of the professor to get me back. I had to do a lap. That was the final. And so that's how I passed. So anyway, crazy fear. And it wasn't until, I think I was talking to a colleague a few years back, that he said, have you ever thought that maybe having crossed the Mekong, really dark waters, in the dead of night, that somehow is imprinted in your subconscious, and that is why you have this fear of water. And again, I hadn't thought of that until he said that, and I went, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. And so I actually had to be hypnotized to get over my fear of water by a colleague who is a licensed hypnotherapist. Yeah, because I would walk by a pool. My kids would be in swim lessons. I would walk by the pool and I would be shaking. And I think the moment, sort of defining moment for me, was when I thought, well, if my kids fell in the pool, I don't think I would be able to jump in and save them. That was how crazy and irrational my fear was. And I love my kids. I would, jump in front of a train for them, but I wouldn't jump into the pool to get them. And so anyway, the hypnotherapy was great, because then I was able to take swim lessons and can sort of swim. Well, gunshots, the fear of stepping on a landmine, hearing kids cry and then not, and then the stories that we heard thereafter in terms of what happened to some of those babies. They were given opium, they were drugged, some were suffocated. I remember a story my mom told about a really big, I think he was a teenager, but he was obese and he couldn't go, he couldn't walk, and we had to move really fast. And the story, I don't know if it's a myth or not, it was that they buried him alive. His family did, because he was slowing them down. And so they fed him tons of opium to knock him out and then buried him alive. And so, so I think, so back to my trepidation about Laos and going back to Laos, I don't know what kind of emotions will surface for me. And I'm not sure that I'm ready to confront those yet. So, so actually one of the things that you asked about, advice for educators, right? So, you have these children that come into your school, at whatever age, they've sort of witnessed and have seen some amazing, crazy, chaotic, violent things. And so just understanding that you never know when the triggers might be or what the triggers might be. And just being prepared to handle those with the sensitivity and delicacy that they really do require, because childhood trauma surfaces in many different ways, and also having an understanding of trauma in children, which is why I think training for educators around trauma is really important, be it refugees or not. We have kids who live in neighborhoods that are very violent here, and suffer great trauma as well. So imagine, your refugee kids coming in who have suffered tremendous loss, personal loss, even if it's not someone that they know, just having heard about it or having been in the journey, with family members or even friends who have, suffered great loss, can have an impact on their psyche and in their emotional, subconscious or conscious state. So certainly that affects the way they learn and how they stay engaged.